Hello everyone and welcome to Improving Scottish Football. My name is Kieran Hennigan. I'm joined today by regular contributor, coach and analyst John Walker and financial expert and Celtic fan James Dailey. So today we are going to be talking about data and analytics, and we're going to be talking about some of the best clubs in the world in this space. So not just in football, we're probably going to talk about baseball, basketball, American football, and so on, and we'll see where the conversation takes us. So please do like, share and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and please also leave us a 5-star review. That would be very much appreciated. So gents, lovely to see you both. James, do you want to just give us a quick introduction to yourself, please, even though you were on season 1 of the podcast going back, possibly almost a year ago? Give us a little refresher as to who you are.
Sure, I'll keep it real quick. So the first part relative to Scottish football, you mentioned Celtic supporter, and I'm part of the Huddle Breakdown, which is we started out as kind of an analytics-focused, performance-based podcast to kind of evaluate Celtic, and that's become more and more about Scottish football generally and industry-wide. It piqued my interest. But my background historically is in kind of financial markets, macroeconomy, business cycles, and related analytics. So that the analytical part of this, came way before the football part of it. About 25 years in that domain. So that's kind of where my anchoring and biases come from, and how I kind of view the analytical aspects of football is with that kind of grounding.
Nice. And so let's start at the very, very basics then. Give us a simple breakdown of the difference between data and analytics, please.
Well, data is basically you're just trying to quantify and measure things. So there are things that are obviously quantifiable and measurable, and then things that are more ephemeral. So the most that you can do is try to quantify as much as you can. And that's where data quality comes in. How do you capture your data? How do you make sure that the data is consistent? So there's that whole realm of data science is hugely important. The phenomenon within analytics is garbage in, garbage out. Analytics is a very close cousin to, kind of the scientific method. Science, it's really the pursuit of truth, as close as we can get to some kind of weird thing called objective truth, if there is such a thing. Don't want to get into philosophy, but so that the data piece is vitally important, but the analytics really sits on top of the data, and that's hugely important because there's a whole domain of how do you do analysis and what techniques do you use, modeling, limitations of modeling, and really how does the world work, and what types of models apply in certain circumstances, and how do you try to draw conclusions. Again, that's where I mentioned that kind of being a cousin of the scientific method. So you have thesis, theories, theorems, you test these things, and then you try to figure things out. Within the context of my realm, it's like, well, how do you figure out where to put your money? How do you invest? In economics, it's like, well, are we going to be in a recession or recovery? How do you, deploy policies to help people or hurt people, depending on your perspective? And then in sports, it's like, well, how do we win? It's kind of simple in sports. How do you give yourself a better edge in order to try and achieve your sporting goals as a sporting institution? So analytics is hugely important in making better quality decisions, taking that data, that information, and then turning that into smart actions and decisions. So I always talk about that analytical piece is the hard part. That's data. When I say hard part, meaning that that's where things like nonlinearity come in, and it gets much more complicated. Data science is challenging. People that do it are, very bright, and some of them are starting to get displaced by AI and machine learning. But it's a vital, important part. But it's not as complicated as that kind of analytics piece.
Cool. And obviously, one of the arguably the best analytics systems in the world is Jamestown. John, do you want to give us kind of your thoughts on obviously the breaking news at Hearts? I say breaking news, I mean a few days ago anyway, but it's all been kind of signed and sealed.
Yeah, I think it's very exciting. This is one of the ones that I think I'd said previously on a podcast. I think when you look at Scottish football, Celtic are streets ahead because for the last 3 out of the 4 managers, well, I know Brendan Rodgers been twice, Celtic have had the best coach in the league taking their players. So Celtic haven't really had to focus on data modelling for recruitment because the coach is probably taking care of most of it. There will be parts data that's contributing to the types of people they sign. But a lot of what success from Celtic's been is from having real elite coaches. Brendan Rodgers is one of the best UK coaches, and he's been Celtic manager twice. Ange Postecoglou, who we knew nothing about really, is probably the best coach that's been in the league for 20 years, as far as I can recall. Rangers are doing neither, unfortunately. They're neither doing the data input or have appointed a good coach, as far as I can see. I think Van Bronckhorst was good, Gerrard was good, Beale was good, but nothing anywhere near what Celtic had. So the recruitment's let down by a lack of data. Now, where Hearts, we've already talked about Aberdeen appointing a manager based on probably good philosophy and data there. Hearts now going into that recruitment is what scares me a little bit as a Rangers fan, because Rangers are now potentially going to get dragged into a battle for being the best of the rest. And I think that's what Hearts have kind of got their claws into with Jamestown and this exclusive, unique deal where they'll be the only people with access in Scottish football to it. They obviously have better data than anyone else is aware of, because if other clubs could replicate it, they would have by now, and you would see those outliers happening, and it wouldn't be such a catch that this analytical company are running around and kind of continually making profits the way they are. That's what concerns me, is that Hearts could now have access to something that gets them players at a reasonable value that Rangers and Celtic aren't even aware of, but Rangers specifically, because that's who I think they're competing with, and how they turn that into results in the pitch, because they're not even that far behind as far as I'm concerned. So yeah, it's a huge concern for me, but also the reason we love this, Kieran, is because I'm for someone that's going, Scottish football is in the dark ages and needs to pull itself forward. And if there's clubs that are going to capitalise on where Rangers are sleeping, more power to them.
And James, you've kind of spoken about this before, about this being a wake-up call for the other kind of Scottish clubs, and even for the likes of Celtic, that they actually need to get their ass in gear on this side of things, because clubs like Hearts could potentially, significantly improve with this sort of analytical package.
I think people underestimate how much of a gap could be closed just based off of this type of migration towards being super smart. And I heard you talk to Joel on a prior episode about some of this and what's going on in Belgium, for example, with one of Bloom's clubs and a Union saying, I won't try to pronounce it. You can do that.
Union Saint-Gilloise.
Saint-Gilloise. There we go.
That was down to Joel, because I was all ready to pronounce that a totally different way before he said it.
Yeah, I wasn't even going to try. But so the issue here is one of in Brighton in English Premier League, they've got robust, as I'll call it, middle class that they have to scale to get over between them and to get to the top of their leagues. Whereas a club like Hearts effectively has a free run. I mean, just has a straight shot right to go after Rangers. And, I'm less, and this is, I'm in a perpetual state of paranoia with relative to Celtic, but I think even Celtic is not safe from this threat. And I don't mean that on like a, perpetual long-term basis. What I'm saying is that Hearts could get up into the point where even if they won 1 out of 5 leagues, right? I mean, given where Scottish football has been for basically 30 years, effectively, 2 clubs, and really in the last 20, it's almost been, 1 club with a couple of leagues and that 3-season run in was about 15 years ago by Rangers. So just penetrating that and getting into the rotation of actually competing and winning the league, I think is imminently doable because of that lack of middle class, and because of what John said, is that there's not this rush to modernize amongst most of the rest of the league. The one club, oddly enough, that has at least moved directionally, but has a limitation on fundamentals is Queen's Park. And even they've kind of, when we talk about this, these things are not linear in the sense that even clubs that modernize will have setbacks, and there's, these are all institutions filled with human beings with egos and political environments. We just saw what went on with Liverpool. Magically Liverpool's at the top of the English Premier League, even though Jurgen Klopp left. I thought he was one of the best managers in the world. How did that happen? So you have these setbacks in embracing of being smart because of power struggles and internal dynamics. And Bucher left Queen's Park, which I would argue was a huge setback for them, most likely. Went to run Ajax, by the way. He didn't leave for some, imagine that. The guy who's running Queen's Park in Glasgow gets hired away to go run the operations at Ajax. What's that tell you? I mean, that's a really weird, it was a weird hiring, and then it was a really weird departure. And I think that has to do with how, this whole area of analytics and the embracing of modernity in sporting is, particularly in football, is still very early in this kind of adoption phase. So when you can find the talent and the people that are switched on, it makes sense to kind of go anywhere you can. And I think, to the point where, specifically on Hearts, I mean, they were like an obvious, other than, Rangers was an obvious candidate, their ownership situation, and, just a lot, it's just a different situation altogether. Whereas Hearts, Aberdeen, Hibs, they were all kind of low hanging fruit in order to, target, I've thought, for quite some time. So I wasn't surprised to see one of them get targeted by somebody like Bloom, because it seemed kind of obvious given the opportunity of two bigger clubs that aren't being run particularly well on a smart basis as far as embracing these things.
And in terms of other Scottish clubs, apart from Queen's Park, are there any other clubs that are doing a half decent job in this space? Anyone else that comes to mind?
I mean, Aberdeen seems to have been trying. It's all levels. So on a relative versus absolute basis, I mean, Aberdeen seems to have been trying. And Celtic have done some things, but this comes back to the discussion on how do the top clubs do in this space, and it has to start top down. It has to be an ownership level, board level, senior management level, and work its way down through. And that's where Celtic has failed. I think it's been made clear by the controlling shareholder that he's not terribly interested in these types of things. And whereas, Aberdeen looks like McCormack has tried, at least directionally, with some fits and starts. Even the hiring of Robertson was a good example of, I think they had a plan to go with the manager that's there now, and then because of internal politics and human beings and board members, and we have to placate fans and all this other stuff, we make this managerial hire that would just completely threw the plan off the rails, and happened not to work. And so these things are not easy to stick to, even if you have ownership that is committed, at least directionally, to try and modernize and to get smarter.
John, how do you see it? Are there any other kind of clubs in Scotland that are doing anything positive in this space?
So probably not so much in the data and analytical side, but I do know that the Airdrie, I know it's a team that I constantly go on about, they are quite invested in looking at the data of youth players and players that are being released from academies. So the boy that scored for Crystal Palace yesterday was at Airdrie after being released by Kilmarnock 2 seasons ago. He was part of the League One promotion. That was a player that they had reviewed the data of and needed to go through. So there are people that understand it. It's a different level as to what's going to happen. Like, one of the big things that I've listened to with Niels Coppin at Rangers is that the data technicians that he's brought into recruitment and what he sees as being the overall plan, the concern, the breakdown for me is it seems like there's a manager who doesn't follow what you're trying to build there. If you're saying data technicians, profile player, Philippe Clement does not understand the profile of any of his players in any of the positions that he wants because they change from player to player, game to game. So even if he's got the best data technicians, he's got the best recruitment people, you're buying them for a manager that I don't think understands or respects what that data modeling looks like. And I think that's one of the things that needs to revolutionise or evolution through Scottish football and the interview process of managers, if you're going to introduce this in Scottish football, is that you need to be very clear when you're interviewing a potential manager or a head coach, what is it you want? So for me, it needs to be some. I've heard of these interview processes and they seem ludicrous to the point that Graham Souness had input on who Rangers were hiring as their manager through nothing other than mentality, and that was it. For me, it would be a head of recruitment or a head of a technical director would literally have a manager in front of them and have a couple of their games, and it'd be almost like a day presentation of me going, so your centre back, what's he doing here? And then show me the data points of what you would want recruited for a centre half, and go into that level of detail before you give the tenure of your club to someone else. When you're paying someone like a Philippe Clement, £1 million or whatever it is a year, and you can't point to what you want on a pitch. So how do you do recruitment? And this is where I think Hearts with Critchley, who we've been told was clearly identified and wanted the job, as being a guy who fit Jamestown's model, who fit what Hearts were looking for. And over the piece, if I look at the Rangers Hearts and Hearts Celtic game, although they got absolutely battered off Celtic on paper last night, I actually think Hearts looked good, and against Rangers they were the better team. So there's already little signs of me going, I mean, once Hearts get the recruitment model in place, oh dear.
Cool. All right. So, James, you wanted to add to that?
Well, I was just going to say, so this comes back to, so I mentioned relative smart versus kind of absolute smart. When I say relative smart, it's working within kind of structural paradigm that are cultural legacy, the orthodox is respected, and then we try to optimize within the context of the orthodoxy, right? So that's kind of the relative. So that's to say, well, this is, one of the ideas that I've been trying to research myself is, how do teams use strikers and dropping them deep, and is that actually a smart thing to do? Period. Outside of like the top strikers in the world, on average, is that a style of play that makes sense on to kind of improve your chances of chance creation and goal scoring? It's orthodoxy that you just do that, right? It's never really been tested, or I haven't seen people go through the data and say, oh, like question this, and then what is it? It doesn't make any sense. Keepers going short versus long contextually. Some of these things just get, like I said, become orthodox because Pep Guardiola started doing it, or some other guy started doing it, and it worked for them in their situation. And then it becomes this Me Too thing where, well, we copycat, and like that's how sport's been, and a lot of things in life has been. So on an absolute basis, smart clubs actually do research and development. They actually question orthodoxy and figure out whether it makes sense to do it at all, quantify it, and then say, okay, well, how do we customize not only our recruitment, but how we're playing relative to objective evidence, and aligning recruitment with the style of play all the way up and down. And that's where you get this kind of compounding effect. That's what Bloom is doing. It's not as simple as finding a good player. It's part of the arbitrage that he's doing is laundering his ability to get that synchronicity up and down and leverage the stupidity of the people that are buying his players, because they're thinking that they're getting a world-class player when in fact part of what they're buying is the alignment of Brighton's style of play with how they're recruiting, right? So Casado's a good midfielder, but is he £100 million midfielder at Chelsea playing for Chelsea? Or was it actually just really smart alignment of a player that fit with the role that he was given within the context of style of play that he was playing that role, and they overpaid for the actual player? So that's what I mean by those kind of two. And I don't think there's anyone in Scotland doing that. kind of that holistic, super smart alignment all the way up, where you say, hey, does this make sense at all? There are a lot of people actually doing within the orthodoxy. Motherwell, I think, is doing really interesting stuff with set plays, for example. There's some really smart people at Motherwell. There's some, smart people at Celtic. But when you've got one of the best coaches in the UK, like Brendan Rodgers, who's got a huge ego, who Ian Graham has publicly said he doesn't really know how to do this kind of alignment of style of play with player. I've seen that evident in the recruitment that Celtic did this past summer with the work that I do. So, who's going to walk in and tell Brendan Rodgers you don't know what you're talking about? That's not a conversation that happens, oh, you have a physics PhD, whatever. I've been coaching for 20 years, right? That's the orthodoxy, is that the vast majority of the industry is still tilted towards the coach or the sports scientist or the ex-player or the egomaniac billionaire owner versus, somebody who has a PhD in astrophysics. And what this arms race is about IQ points. It's not about your actual football pedigree. Same, it's happening in baseball, basketball, hockey, across sports. So that I just wanted to address that, because that relative and absolute is the key. And so Bloom is in that realm of absolute, and that's how he's making that, leaps and bounds above other clubs and individuals that are on a relative basis doing decent things.
Good. Well, that's a nice jumping off point then to go and talk about some other sports. So in the last pod, I talked to Joel about Hearts and Jamestown, and we ended up chatting about the Tampa Bay Rays. And that kind of was the kicking off point where I thought, quite fancy getting James back on the pod, because I think we referenced them, like I said, about a year ago. So I think it'd be great to just dive into them a little bit. And if you don't mind, James, just give us a little bit. I've got a very limited knowledge of what they do and how they operate. Just pull back the curtain and tell us a little bit about them.
I'll provide some big context, because I think that's hugely important. So they're in the American League East. So baseball is split into two leagues, American and National, and they're in a division with the New York Yankees, Boston Red Sox, two of the largest payroll, biggest teams in all of baseball. And Tampa runs on a budget that's about 20, 25, maybe 30% of those teams. And they were kind of a Moneyball 2.0 adopter. So you had the Oakland A's, which is the famous team where Bean worked at, in the book and the movie were made about. And I talk about that kind of like Newtonian physics, right? So that very important, hugely applicable. Like, it was a big deal that we figured out that the apple drops and what's gravity. But then Einstein took things and went to another level, and in physics. And the Rays have kind of been in that space as far as, okay, like really go to that next level of taking data and analytics and making smart decisions. And if you look at their front office, for example, I mean, it's just staffed to the hilt with, I put something out a while back. They have 19 people listed on their website that are just in research and development. And this is, I think their payroll is around 80 million US dollars. So that gives you an idea, how many people are dedicated at Celtic or Rangers to research and development. My guess is zero. And how many football clubs in general have people that have degrees in STEM fields that all they do 40 hours a week is sit there and think, questioning what we're doing and does it make sense, and then try to get evidence and research and build models and test it. So you have 19 people over here, zero people over there. So that's that gap. That's why I talk about the orthodoxy. There's no questioning of norms, and as I joke, that's what Moneyball like 1.0 was about. Is, well, you have a guy who's fast and plays shortstop, he should bat leadoff because he hits 300. And what Moneyball was about was saying, hey, your fat first baseman who can't run, that walks a lot, who gets on base 40% of the time, is actually a better leadoff hitter. And telling that to a guy who's been in baseball for 30 years in 2002, thought you were a freaking maniac and a moron if you made that case, right? The orthodoxy was so firm and fit. So this is when I bring up something like, should strikers drop deep? And it's just taken as orthodoxy. So the Tampa has taken all kinds of things, tested them, and have pushed the envelope in strategy as far as what they do intra-game, player development, drafting. It's obviously a totally different system in baseball as far as how talent is acquired because of the draft system and kind of minor league baseball relative to football. But so they've been able to really shape, and this is, again, they haven't won a World Series yet, by the way. So this is not as if it's it's a magic bullet. But they took that step and built on top of Moneyball. And then what actually happened is they created enough pressure on some of the big boys that the big boys started stealing their talent, effectively hiring away their talent. And now you have the Los Angeles Dodgers, for example, who have won their division, I don't know, a million years in a row now, and just won the World Series for the first time since the late 80s, a full season. I think they won it during lockdown season, but that doesn't count. Celtic fans don't think that season counts. Right, John? Right, John? So they basically lifted out the guy who was running the Rays front office like 12 years ago. And now the Dodgers are a behemoth because they're not only taking smart and analytics, they've got the money. Like they spend 5-6 times what the Rays do, and they have the resources. So that's where Man City is. That's where Liverpool are. That's theoretically where Barcelona or Madrid could get to if they would do the same thing. So yeah, I like looking at the Rays because of their kind of sequence, the role in the sequence of the evolution of baseball, how baseball was on the front end of all of this. And the fact that it's not a magic bullet, like there's ups and downs, you have to refresh. It's about being smart. It's not figuring out one angle and arbitrage and that's going to stay there forever. These things are dynamic systems, so you have to adjust going forward, and you have setbacks, you have seasons they just had a down season, for example. Doesn't mean that they're horribly run or anything. It's they're Kilmarnock competing against Celtic, right? It's like they're not gonna win the league every year. If they just get up there to finish close, would be a good accomplishment. And that's kind of where the Rays have been, but legitimately competing. They've made it to World Series. Like they're just a brilliantly run organization.
And these 19 people who all work in research and development, these are not baseball guys, right? You referenced earlier astrophysics. So a lot of these are all from outside of the sport, right?
I mean, you'll get like ex minor leaguers or, somebody that went to Carnegie Mellon that played sandlot baseball in the summers, like people that have a passion for the sport usually, or oftentimes, but not always. I mean, they hire across kind of the talent pool. I think I mentioned this to you when I appeared last year. They have these radical hiring practices of hiring women. John, can you imagine that? Hiring a woman to do something in football that's not for the women's team? I mean, that would be shocking. Or in an analytics capacity or in a coaching capacity. Or they actually had a general manager, like a senior person, was a woman. Is a woman. She's departed the organization. I say was because she's no longer there. But so yeah, they run things smartly across the board, and to do that, you need smart people. I mean, that's the thing. And it's not that people involved in sport can't be smart. It's just that when you're talking about analytics specifically, you're talking about people that tend to navigate towards STEM fields. Like physics, like engineering, They tend to their minds tend to work in that way. And, so that's where they draw from is people that are trained and have talent in that kind of space. And that's the amazing thing. Like, you don't have to pay these people a massive amount of money. Like, you can hire a physicist for, a fraction of what Celtic and Rangers flush down the toilet on bad recruitment signings.
See, just on that, James, can I jump in there? Because I'm looking at a lot of this, right? And that you've just touched on something that I was going to ask that I think is so blatantly obvious, staring me in the face, is I don't know Philippe Clement's wage, right? I'm sorry to go back to Rangers, but obviously this is a bugbear for me right now. Philippe Clement, I think is in the region of 1 to 1.3 million as an annual salary. Rangers can attract a head coach on 500,000. Absolutely no brainer, no problem. You could, with that extra budget, have a set play analyst and coach. You could have 4 extra recruitment analysts. You could hire the kind of data technicians that you're talking about that Niels Coppin said he's brought in. You could fulfill that 1.3 million budget with staff that would be there permanently, whoever the manager is thereafter and before, who are building a process that can continually work. And what you're doing there is aligning that with the English Premier League. And when the English Premier League are looking for a new set play analyst, they come and knock on Rangers or Celtic's door and pay you 1.5 million for the analyst. And you're actually creating a profit within your coaching staff. That's happening in England. Man U took Lillestrøm's head coach, who was at Southampton. Chelsea took Brentford's and paid 1.7 million for him. And then what that does is you then maybe have Kilmarnock have a set play analyst on 18 grand a year, but it's an intern that's doing that kind of stuff. And Rangers go and take him and give money to Kilmarnock from the 1.2 they just gained from a Chelsea or Man United taking a set. And you create this factory of money going through Scottish football just by being a bit smarter. And this is the thing that bothers me when you're saying they've got 19 people in R&D that are probably contributing, and their wages are probably a fraction of what the head coach is getting, but within alignment. And what you're saying is the big clubs who are now catching on are going and looking at their staff and stealing their staff. And that is it's an actual cycle you can see of benefiting the smaller people.
Well, so this is part of what the sport of football is not ready for from an orthodoxy perspective, is that the head coach doesn't matter that much. Culturally, they're way overvalued as far as, like, this goes back to, the history, the culture, and you had those same people, like the monarchical, figureheads, the bigger than life personalities. And so that's what has been a struggle within the sport of baseball, for example, is, just hiring a guy who's got EQ, who's able to manage the dressing room, to manage the egos. But the brainchild's coming out of the front office. It's coming out of the analytics staff. Now, that has some downside too, because if you're not doing your analytics well, it doesn't matter. Like, it's still where the brain is coming from as far as making the decision. So, this is not to say that all analytics is good analytics either. You can have it done poorly, or you can deviate from, as I talked about, because of politics and egos. But what's the way I look at it, the way I break it down, is when you're talking about like the regular season in baseball or the league campaign in football, for example, you're talking about the vast majority of why teams win or lose has to do with how much money do they spend, how much do they have to spend, variance in football in particular, because there's a ton of luck involved with football, even over a 38 or a 34 or 30 game league campaign, where the manager comes in, where the value of the manager comes in. Same in baseball, it's in the playoffs. And in football, it's in knockout games. It's in tournament football. And that's where I think if you take that paradigm that I just laid out, what I'm about to say is going to cause a lot of people to think I'm a complete lunatic, probably. But Pep Guardiola is horribly overrated, just like Bill Belichick was horribly overrated as a football coach in the NFL. If you do a kind of a sophisticated attribution analysis of why things happen, if Pep Guardiola was such a great manager, his record in knockout football wouldn't be so crappy, particularly in Europe, right? So he's won these leagues because he's had the biggest budget teams with the best talent. So, has he not screwed things up royally? Well, probably not. Has he come up with some new ideas, and is he a smart guy, and is he innovative? I think so. I mean, that seems to be what people tell me. I don't have any reason to disbelieve that. But so was Bill Belichick. And when Tom Brady left, so did New England's success. Goodbye. Now, NFL is different because the quarterback is a kind of uniquely important position in all of sports, as far as how important they are relative to the team's success. But managers generally are hugely overvalued in football as far as what their actual role is. Now, historically, it did make sense because they were the ones given all the power. So if you had, there's stories of Jock Steen doing stats and doing schematics and stuff 60 years ago. So it's not like, there was a lot of the stuff that was going on 80, 100 years ago. Like, people weren't morons 100 years ago. There were people that were figuring a lot of this stuff out anecdotally and even quantifying some of it. But what's happened is technology's improved, data's improved, analytics has improved, is that it's hard for an individual to keep up with that. To be a good coach, to be a good person on strategy, on managing people. Oh, and you're going to be a world-class analytics person? I mean, that's ridiculous. You're going to be like a genius in all of these areas? That's absurd. So we've seen that across sports now, is this overvaluing of the head coach. And as you break down the intelligence of organizations in sport and you kind of silo them into these different roles, the valuing of each of those components, the money should really be going into like director of football level. And that's where the arbitrage is now, where you can hire like super smart, talented people that run this kind of stuff for probably, to your point, John, like a fraction of what they're worth. And certainly the amount of money that's going towards managers. And look at what Brighton's done. I mean, is Brighton running around begging to overpay star managers? No. And yet other teams hire away their managers and flush money down the toilet. So that should give you a pretty good insight.
And of course, like, managers and players want to go to Brighton because, they've obviously built up such a great reputation of being such a well-run club and everything. So it's so much easier to attract people. John, is there anything else you want to add on to that? Because if not, I'm going to move on to the next example on our list we're going to talk about, which is the Philadelphia 76ers.
Yeah, no, that's what I want to do. I want to now look, because we've seen the Moneyball movie and read the book and heard all about it. I do want to hear about how the NBA and NFL are catching up.
Okay, so James, give us a little bit about Daryl Morey, because he was someone you wanted to kind of chat to us about.
Well, this is a personally painful conversation because I'm a Philadelphia 76ers fan. And I believe going into tonight's game, tips off in about 2 hours. They are 3-13 to start the season. And so the history of the Sixers is kind of it's a whole thing, where like the lovable losers type of mentality. But Daryl Morey kind of came up in a non-traditional route. He actually worked with Bill James at one point for an organization connected to Bill James, who was kind of the patriarch of Moneyball. He's the one that started the newsletter back in the 70s that resulted in Billy Beane, and actually ended up working for the Boston Red Sox. So he's like the patron saint of baseball analytics. And so Daryl had a connection there in the late 90s, I think, and then kind of got into basketball, worked in the Celtics front office a little bit, and then got his first big job with the Houston Rockets, actually. And he was there and was kind of on the forefront of this crazy shift in NBA basketball to shooting 3-point shots, and doing more sophisticated data analytics to figure out how to better utilize and how to play the game of basketball. So this was not only, in football, it's very much about recruitment still. In basketball, it actually went very fast into like, how do we make better decisions on the court in order to outscore our opposition? And quite simply, 3 points is worth more than 2. But it took a long time for people in the NBA to figure that out, amazingly, because the 3-point line was actually put in as a rule in 1979. And I've posted on this on Twitter. If you look at the kind of growth rate and the number of 3-point attempts it took 30 years for people to really accelerate. And Daryl was kind of central in that, to the point where I think in his kind of last couple of seasons at Houston, they shot, I think, 45 3-point shots a game. And in the first season that the 3-point line came in, I think teams averaged 2. So that gives you, again, an idea of the scope of how much the game of basketball has shifted, fueled by analytics. Now, he's never won an NBA title as a general manager or president of basketball operations, sadly, for the Sixers fans. And there's a lot of critics of what he's done and how he's hired and who he's, traded for, and how he's, navigated the salary cap and all these other things. So I go back to this idea that just because you're trying to get smarter to make smart decisions, it doesn't mean that this stuff always works. Right? So the whole idea of analytics is taking the past, what us analytics geeks call ex post, right? So what actually happened in the past, and then build models to try and make decisions for the future. But guess what? No one can predict the future. So you're talking about probabilities, right? So you're saying, well, if I can take my probabilities where I could win a title from 15% to 20%, if you're someone in Daryl Morey's role and you do that, how do I know that I've actually improved my odds by 5% if I lose every year? Right? Which is imminently the most likely possibility, is because you only have a 20% chance of winning every season. Right? So how do you actually measure that? How do you figure out how you're making good decisions, and doing a good job, so to speak? So the Sixers are a perfect example of, overall, I think they've been pretty well run, but they've had a lot of bad luck and bad variance with injuries. Like, this goes back to football. There's a lot that can go wrong. So this is not some, as I keep saying, magic bullet, but it's getting smarter to skew the odds as much as you can towards your favor, so that when that variance hits, you can either be resilient towards it, i.e. on the negative side, or kind of capture it and harness it in order to win trophies, to win titles, that kind of thing when luck swings your direction. So the more times it swings your direction, the more things that you're there to actually benefit from it. So I don't think they're going to recover from 3-13 this season to win the NBA title, although there would be a certain symmetry to that, given that this whole kind of Sixers era was launched by what they call the process, which was actually the first intentional tanking that took place, which is a whole nother phenomenon that was ushered in through analytics in North American sports, which is because of the draft system. The worst team in the league gets the highest pick. So a guy named Sam Hinkie was the general manager of the Sixers, was the first one to have the cojones to do this, and said, we're going to intentionally suck so that we can get the top draft pick. And people hated it. And that was called the process. So I think it would be symmetrical if this season we suck at the beginning of the season and then come back from it. Because that's kind of how this whole process started with the Sixers about 10, 12 years ago now.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially about the kind of using analytics to make better decisions on court. Probably a recent football example that kind of springs to mind is Brentford. And I know you've kind of chatted about this, John, a little bit. And I think it was also featured on kind of Monday Night Football recently, where the team seems to be coached in a way to, enhance the chances of scoring from any particular situation. Can you just give us a little bit of an explanation on that?
Myself?
Yeah.
For me, I'm kind of obsessed with this, and I've become a bit obsessed with it. And it's not really. I try and say this to a lot of my mates. See things like XG. They're not as ludicrous or stupid as you think. We've all had the conversation where we go, that player scores that chance 9 times out of 10. We've all had those types of generic statements being said. They're very much that. You very rarely, and a goal for 30 yards is 1 in 100. Like, that is what it is. So you can quantify that by saying, yeah, that shot. I look at Vaclav Černý for Rangers. He scored a couple of absolute worldies from outside the box. But yesterday he hit 8 shots from outside the box. and the one he scored was inside the box after a nice play. So he's hit 7 shots from outside the box that have yielded like a 16% chance at goal overall, right? There are players in other positions in those exact examples whereby they're in better positions. Some players are in a 30% chance of scoring, and he's ignored. And I know for a fact that as instructed by Philippe Clement that he wants players when they're 25 yards within goal and central, if they've got a yard, get a shot off, because you never know what will happen. It's a misunderstanding of somebody who doesn't know how to interpret data. He's taken the idea that Czerny can score from 25 yards and making it an absolute that Czerny should shoot because of that. And that's what they're doing. Whereas Brentford recognise that, yes, a player will often score from 30 yards. It can happen. We see it. Match of the Day's full of highlight reels. Steven Gerrard's career's full of 30-yarders. Of course it can happen. More often than not, goals are scored from within the box and players within the width of the 6-yard box. So how do you find players in those positions and make sure that happens? And Brentford literally pull all the possession they have within the V, they call it, within 40 yards from goal, and when they make the correct decision to do the extra pass for the simple goal. And it's actually something that Nordsjælland do over in Denmark. They call it, it's the exact same language. It's the extra pass for the simple goal. And I love it because it just makes so much sense. It's not try to eradicate these goals from outside the box that we've seen at the Euros. But the phenomenon at the Euros was that everyone was jumping into a low block for some reason. And it's probably the basketball three-pointer thing, where if teams keep hitting three-pointers, teams are going to press more aggressively at the other end of the court because they go, teams want to get to the three-pointers. So let's take the risk of losing it here and conceding 2, and we'll do it that way. So if teams are going to low block in football, there'll be a rise in shots from outside the box. If teams press, there's going to be a rise in goals in behind. It's just logical, but you need to be able to interpret that data. And Brentford and their coaching staff are people that are very good at doing it.
Yeah. Do you want to add to that, James, at all?
No, yeah, Brentford's another one of these clubs that's just doing very interesting things. Set pieces, I think, are another area that they've been specializing in. And this is an example. It just drives me berserk. You know, when I'm watching a team in Scotland that's playing, mostly when, you know, I'll go berserk in this way when they're playing Rangers, and they have a throw in from deep in the attacking third, and let's say it's at a grounds like Kilmarnock or even Tynecastle, and I'll see Hearts is before Tony Bloom getting in the building, or, you know, his people getting in the building, not take a long throw and not put it in, you know, in that V, as John is saying. Like every single team outside of the top 2 in Scotland on a probabilistic basis, if you have an angled way to get a long throw in inside that attacking area, should be doing it. Like it's a because the vast majority of the time when they try a traditional throw and they lose possession and give it right back to either Celtic or Rangers. Like it's so commonsensically obvious if you see things through this kind of analytical lens. You right away you see, well, that coach doesn't know what they're doing relative to analytics, or else they'd be making long throws like constantly. And that's, like I said, a team like Motherwell, they're taking this page where they're saying everything is a set piece for us. Like if we're within a quarter mile of the box, we are launching that bad boy up and trying to create chaos in the opposition box. And they're planning plays around it. They're structuring how they're going about doing it. And that's what Brentford does. Brentford runs actual set plays, not just set pieces, sophisticated ways of moving people, some by the rules, some not by the rules, you know, using picks, screens, all of this stuff. I had a conversation with someone who works at a club one time. I'm like, you know, have you watched NBA games? Like, you know, go watch a pick and roll and watch a staggered pick and roll where the guy who sets the pick, his man gets picked. And then you get a second and third derivative of guys getting picked and rolling around, right? And you don't see any of that. I very rarely do see that in football. It's exactly the same. Like you could have, you know, these very sophisticated, orchestrated set plays, and Brentford's one of those clubs that has really pushed the boundaries on being more sophisticated.
And I honestly, just to touch on that, I think if I love Arsenal, I think if you watch Arsenal, Ben White specifically, Arsenal have a very NBA style final third throw in that they do with two different runners of Odegaard and Saka, where they rotate 3 times before running them behind the fullback, and it gets flung into the box for the Saka to run onto and try and cross first time. It's a proper basketball type maneuver that is worked on, and it's no different from chucking a long throw in. I would almost say, I bet Rangers and Celtic genuinely don't even know who the best throw-in takers are at the club. Like, don't know who a long throw-in taker is.
John, fullbacks take throw-ins.
Oh, don't, please don't start me.
But that's the kind of orthodoxy, right? This is the one thing I loved with Ange was that whoever's closest to the ball, throw the fucking thing in. Right? This is not brain surgery. Just get the damn ball back in. Right, because that defense is organized, and in rest defense, even on set pieces, they're more likely to do it. So do it when they're disorganized. At least that's a freaking plan that makes sense. And within the lens of Ange ball and how dominant Celtic were domestically, I think it made a lot of sense. So to me, that made analytical sense. He shouldn't be doing long throws, given the composition of the squad and the size and the front line. Kyogo is your striker. Like you don't want to throw long throws for headers for Kyogo. That would be stupid. So it's about being coherent based off of what you have at your disposal, and spending 30 seconds waiting for James Tavernier to walk up to take the throw in, which I'm sure you've been having nightmares about for years now, when the winger could just take the damn ball and throw it into a midfielder right away.
Well, even the flip side of that was specifically on Rangers and data is arguably most of Rangers' chances come from second balls, from balls getting put into the box. So there's actually an argument, as much as I hate it, is that Rangers should in the final third develop a throw-in that gets launched into the box and have the people in the key areas picking up the second ball. Because, that's, I've tearing my hair out, that's what a lot of Rangers crossing is. It's launched into the box aimlessly in the hope that it's headed back out when defenders are retreating and we're stepping onto it. It's actually, like, I will defend a lot. Like, Clement almost has a style of play within the horrible thing that you have to watch, because he does clearly want that type of chaos. He just wants balls launched into the box, coming out, picking up, shot. That is a style of play. And I think with Rangers and analytics, I'd be like, well, why aren't you launching long throws into the box? Because that's what you like. You like them having to defend the box and clear the ball. And as the data, then you would have data sets to point to how effective those throw-ins are and what you're creating. Because right now it's not it, but.
Well, and so this, John, comes back to this. I talked about it, like, relatively, like the synchronicity all the way up and down. So the idea of, I talked to David Sumter. We had him on our podcast a week and a half ago from Soccermatics, and the author of Soccermatics. And I was talking to him about this, which is John Muller's piece on Barnsley when they were doing what John Muller recoined Skyball, which was that season in the championship where they almost got promoted to the English Premier League with the lowest wage bill in the championship. They were playing the most disgusting long ball, eyesore, based off of orthodoxy style of play that almost got them into the English Premier League. And how did they accomplish that? Because they had guys like Daryl DK, who was as close to being an NFL linebacker as he is to being a Champions League level striker based off of orthodoxy, running around, causing complete chaos, and on a spatial basis, structuring their midfield based off of chaos. So winning those second balls, right? So there's no right or wrong on style of play from an analytics perspective. It's how do I optimize the matchup of this team versus that team of style of play relative to my talent pool? How am I going to recruit relative to that? And how does it all make sense? What my resources are available based off of my wage bill compared to the league I'm in. Right. And this goes back to the Rays. How the Rays decided is that we're not going to be able to compete against the New York Yankees on signing Aaron Judge or Juan Soto to $500 million contracts for them to hit 50 home runs a season. We've got to have, a bunch of young guys who can throw 100 miles an hour coming out of our bullpen that people can't hit. And that was the edge that they figured out based off of their resources. So they have figured out how to draft those dudes and develop them like a freaking conveyor belt. It's unbelievable. And so, Barnsley figured out the equivalent of 100-mile-an-hour throwing dudes, which was kicking the ball super high every chance they get and cause chaos, and having people that are good at that, which are actually pretty cheap to find because most people don't find those players horrible. And that was actually the downfall of their process, because they couldn't sell any of their players because no one wanted their players because they were playing rugby, not football, right? Or that's the view. So yeah, it's not even that Clermont couldn't succeed playing that way, in my view. It would be, how do you align recruitment, strategy, in-game tactics to optimize for chaos? And that's what this is all about.
And I think you've pretty much nailed it there as well. But Brentford have pretty much figured out a kickoff that causes chaos. And
Absolute chaos.
I see Rangers do this same kickoff, but they do not put extra players over on the side they're kicking it to. Brentford put 3 wingers on the right. They put it to that area and they go, that team are never going to move their right back over to follow our left winger for the kickoff. They're going to keep in position. So we're actually increasing our odds of picking up the second ball. And then you go, yeah, see, that's a long ball kickoff with analytical understanding as to how you get the second ball, as you put 4 wingers on one side and kick it that way. Rangers do that with 1 winger that's normally Bizrami, who's never won a head in his life. And you go, yeah, so there is a way to play long ball football and long ball kickoffs I hate to see, but there's a way of doing it in which you increase your odds with data and analytics to go, we will get the ball in the final third or win a throw in and we'll start an attack. And Brentford now have this issue where obviously it's stopped now because of the last 2 games, but they had an issue whereby when they played Tottenham in the third game, Tottenham were petrified when they got kickoff. And you put that in people's heads, you go, Brentford have scored in the first minute of the last 2 games, and they did it again because teams are panicking, and you create you kind of create the false positive of like it's going to happen now because you're putting it in that people's mind.
Guys, this has been thoroughly enjoyable. I feel like we could go on all night, but what I suggest we do is we park it there and maybe pick this up in a future episode. Does that sound good?
I think the next couple of years are going to be fascinating as this Bloom Hearts Jamestown nexus plays out. So we'll have ample opportunities to revisit and chronicle how this all unfolds. So yeah, look forward to it. Thanks for having me back on. John, it's been a pleasure.
You too.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, fantastic. Guys, thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming on. And a big thank you to everyone who was listening.